The many people taking exception with what the president has already done is, as Josh was mentioning there, retired Admiral William McRaven. As to explain to you who he is, you have to know what he was doing when they snapped this iconic photo in the White House Situation Room back in 2011. The president and his national security team monitoring the takedown of Osama bin Laden. Where was Admiral McRaven at that moment? Not in the picture. Why? Because he was in Afghanistan. He was overseeing that operation. He has since retired and has made a point of staying out of partisan politics, which makes the op-ed that he wrote in today's Washington Post so extraordinary. In it, he tells the president, as we just alluded to, quote, "I would consider it an honor if you would revoke my security clearance as well, so I can add my name to the list of men and women who have spoken up against your presidency." He then adds, and listen to this, quote, "Through your actions, you have embarrassed us in the eyes of our children, humiliated us on the world stage, and worst of all, divided us as a nation." Reaction now from someone who knows the admiral very well. He is CNN military analyst and retired Army Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. General Hertling, thanks so much for taking the time. You served with Admiral McRaven in Europe, in Iraq, in the midst of the Iraq War. He's no wilting flower. He's a former Navy SEAL. He commanded all U.S. special operators. What would compel him, in your view, to take what is really a remarkable step here?
Primarily, Jim, because he's courageous. I think I know Bill McRaven very well. As you said, we did serve together in Europe. And he was the special ops, the JSOC commander in Iraq when I commanded the 1st Armored Division. He is a man of courage, of few words, but he's very succinct and courageous in terms of what he speaks. And he's a true American patriot. He understands our Constitution, and he knows what right looks like. I was very proud to serve with Bill McRaven back when we were both in uniform, and I'm especially proud of the fact that he did, in fact, speak out today against some of the president's actions.
And speak out indeed. Through our actions, he wrote, "You have embarrassed us in the eyes of our children, humiliated us on the world stage, worst of all, divided us as a nation." There's a tendency of the president's loyalists to dismiss his critics, his public critics, as members of the deep state, as members of the resistance, as Obama loyalists, etc. Can you say that about Admiral McRaven?
Well, what I'd say is, again, I'll keep using the word courageous. He is a true servant of America. He has dedicated his life in selfless service to our country. And what I'd say, Jim, truthfully, is anyone who's not speaking out against this despicable action by our president is somewhat of a coward. And the president, Admiral McRaven, retired Admiral McRaven, has stepped forward and said exactly the way he feels. And I think there should be more people saying exactly that, because Mr. Brennan is also a true patriot.
Let me ask you this. You've commanded troops. You've commanded them in combat. How much does his voice impact the men and women down the ranks when they see someone as experienced and as respected as this, not political by any means, speak out in such strong terms? Do they listen? Does it have an impact?
Well, there are many. The forces in America's military fall on both sides of the spectrum of the left and the right. Just they represent America, Jim, just like the rest of the American population. So they are tending to believe one thing or another based on the narrative that they hear. But what is different in Admiral McRaven's words are he is speaking truth. He is speaking the facts. It has nothing to do with a narrative or an opinion. This is the way he sees it in terms of protecting America and ensuring that we continue with the right to free speech, which is, I think, why he is speaking up and saying, hey, take my security clearance too. And I'll add my voice to that as well. I've only used my security clearance a couple times since I've been retired. But if this is what the president is going to do, what I'd say, along with Admiral McRaven, is take mine too, because we are speaking out in selfless service to our country. We take an oath to our Constitution, the things that are right, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And we have seen that violated in the last 18 months, and especially in the last few weeks, as the president has used political means to foster his goals and his objectives.
General Mark Hertling, thanks very much.
My pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
More now on what critics are calling President Trump's own enemies list. Joining us for that, CNN legal analyst John Dean, who worked for a president who famously and loudly considered the press his enemy. Also CNN political analyst Carl Bernstein, who, along with Bob Woodward and CBS's Daniel Schorr, were perhaps Richard Nixon's least favorite members of his least favorite profession. John Dean, amazingly, 47 years ago today, you wrote a White House memo, the subject line of which was dealing with our political enemies, included the quote on how to screw them. How do you compare what President Nixon did and threatened to do then to what you saw from President Trump this week?
Well, there are similarities. There's no question, and I didn't realize it at the time I was instructed to write that memo, how deep and angry Nixon was and the revenge he sought against people with whom he disagreed or perceived as enemies. I know it from the tapes today. It was even worse than I thought. I was trying to throw in their face something I thought they'd find offensive. That memo was approved. What never happened, though, in the Nixon administration is they didn't execute on these enemies' attacks. Whereas in the Trump presidency, we're seeing the execution first and the explanation afterwards.
Carl, it's been interesting to watch the reaction. Of course, many Democrats have criticized the president's move here. Republicans, though, largely, there have been some exceptions, they've either been supporting the president's move against Brennan or again shrugging it off as not important. I wonder when you hear a similar message from Admiral McRaven. He headed Special Operations Forces. He commanded the Bin Laden raid. He oversaw the Bin Laden raid. Can he be dismissed, put in the same category as John Brennan?
We see Donald Trump attempting to put everyone who opposes him into that category and acting in an authoritarian manner, seeking to undermine both their credibility as well as to punish those who speak the truth as they have seen it. And there's no reason to expect that the same might not be true of the admiral. What John Dean is talking about and what we're seeing here, both in the Nixon presidency and even worse in the Trump presidency, are authoritarian actions. In Nixon's case with the enemies list, it was authoritarian words. Now, there were other authoritarian actions by Nixon for which he was impeached and for which he had to leave office. We are seeing a good number of authoritarian actions by President Donald Trump, and those are some of the things that the special prosecutor, Mr. Mueller, is looking at, including a likely obstruction of justice to further what he has done in terms of his authoritarian actions.
We should remind viewers that when Sarah Sanders announced the revocation of Brennan's clearance, she read a long list of other names of officials whose clearances, former officials whose clearances are now being reviewed. Those include the former CIA Director Michael Hayden, the former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, who've since come out and said, basically dared the White House, saying, "Go ahead, revoke our clearances, but we're not going to speak.
The most important words.
Stop talking.
The most important words, Jim, that we've heard are from President Trump in his interview with the Wall Street Journal yesterday, in which he stated without any reservation or qualification that he took this action and might take further action, not because there is any breach of national security, but because, quote, these are the people who led the intelligence gathering that began, in his view, the Mueller investigation. He has made it clear that he is doing this for retributive reasons, which indeed get into the area of obstruction of justice. And let me say one thing about what I can tell by talking, as I have, to many lawyers for those whom Mueller has interrogated their clients, as well as I've talked to some of the clients and witnesses. And it's very clear that Mueller is going both for a investigation into likely collusion, conspiracy, with a foreign power. We'll see if it envelops Donald Trump or not. It certainly looks like it's enveloping those around him, as well as an obstruction of justice in trying to cover up those activities. And I think we can tell by now that Mueller is on his way to putting forth a vast narrative, a report that illustrates both the cover-up and the actions that were taken that led to the cover-up. And the cover-up, of course, involves Donald Trump. And what we are witnessing now, I believe, and certainly people around the President of the United States that I talk to who support him believe that he is running terrified.
John, let me ask you, though, what we do know, we don't know where Mueller, how far Mueller is going to go. We do know, and Carl makes a good point, that three of the senior most intelligence officials who were behind the assessment that Russia interfered in the election, including to help Donald Trump, James Comey, he's been fired. John Brennan, he was head of the CIA. He has now had his clearance removed. And James Clapper, he's now been threatened to have his clearance removed. Do you see a method to this beyond pettiness?
Well, pettiness is certainly present, but there also might be an effort to try to influence them as witnesses, that he's going to make their life miserable. And then we're getting into the area beyond obstruction and into witness tampering. So he's walking a very fine line when he starts going after these people and saying, as he did to the Wall Street Journal, that he's going after them because of their work on the Russia investigation. It is not a witch hunt. It will be shown not to be a witch hunt. And he's going to be left out there with his actions that he may well have to explain to a grand jury.